Good evening. I'm Alan Barron, and I have the honor of introducing Walt Slocombe, our speaker tonight. When I was asked by Rob Hillis and Pamela Hughes who I had in mind as a speaker for the Friends of the Institute, Walt Slocombe was at the top of my list. Walt and I were classmates at Princeton, and everyone who knew Walt or knew of him was aware that he was the academic star of our class. We were certain he was destined to do great things, and it turns out we were right. Walt graduated from Princeton summa cum laude. He spent 2 years at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, after which he entered Harvard Law School, where he was the notes editor of the Law Review. And upon graduation, Walt clerked for Justice Fortas on the Supreme Court. Walt has been a partner in the DC law firm of Kaplan and Drysdale, but much of his career has been spent in public service. What I'm about to relate is but a small sample of Walt's public service career, and I hope I picked the right things because I did it on my own without consulting with him. Walt was appointed by President Clinton as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from September 1994 to January 2001. In 2003, he volunteered to serve as Senior Advisor and Director for Security Affairs in the Coalition Provisional Authority for Iraq. In 2004, he was appointed by President Bush to be a member of the Presidential Commission on U.S. Intelligence Capabilities Regarding Weapons of Mass Destruction. He's also participated in studies by the National Academy of Sciences on ballistic missile defense, on the legal and ethical implications of offensive information operations, and on prompt global strike capabilities. From 2013 to 2017, he was a member of the State Department's International Security Advisory Board. He's been a visiting fellow at the Australian Defence College's Centre for Defence and Strategic Studies. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Walt has been awarded the Department of Defense Distinguished Public Service Medal on 5 occasions, as well as the Award for Distinguished Service in the Pursuit of Peace. He has also received awards from Germany, the Republic of Korea, and Poland. But I suspect that the award he treasures most is being named an honorary submariner by the U.S. Navy's Fleet Submarine Force. Princeton in the nation's service is a treasured concept at the university, and Walt Slocombe has embodied that high ideal throughout his career. So without further ado, Walt will speak to us this evening on nuclear weapons policy in the age of Putin and Xi. Walt?
Well, thank you all for coming, and Alan, thank you for that generous introduction. My mother might have believed it. It's an honor to be here, and this is a not terribly pleasant subject, but an important one. And unfortunately, nuclear dangers and nuclear deterrence have returned to the forefront of U.S. defense policy concerns. The last time I was in full-time service in the government, in the period from 1993 to 2001, was one of great optimism. There was a realistic hope, and from the fall of the wall to the first decade, well into the first decade of this century, that a combination of the collapse of the USSR, the focus of China on economic development and peaceful rise, and massive U.S. conventional superiority in military affairs would allow for dramatically decreased salience of nuclear weapons and big reductions, even the hope of abolition. There were threats, but they were proliferation, nuclear terrorism, and the security of nuclear material. The only serious deterrence issue was rogue states like North Korea. Now, to be sure, deterrence was not wholly forgotten in those years. In practice, the United States hedged its programs against deterioration of relations with Russia, but significant arms control measures were agreed in that period. That context has changed fundamentally, and as a result, deterrence is back on center stage. Most important, of course, the relationship between the United States and its allies with Russia has deteriorated drastically. Over the course of the last decade or so, Russia, as a part of its general revival, has revived its military, and more problematic, has taken a much more assertive and confrontational line in its international relations, exemplified by its military operations against Georgia and Ukraine, its intervention in Syria, and widespread intervention and interference in foreign elections, including in the United States. In all this, there is a strong nuclear element. Russia has embarked on a comprehensive modernization of its nuclear forces, including the development of new types of weapons, not simply replacement of existing ones. And it has continued and even increased assignment of nuclear weapons to a central role in Russian military doctrine, including the possibility of using military threats to back up conventional aggression. China has also become much more assertive in foreign policy, and this is backed up by a small but sophisticated nuclear force. China has put its priority not on the size of the force, it's actually only approximately, in terms of sheer numbers, the size of the French or the British, but on survivability. Mobile ICBMs and submarine-launched ballistic missiles have replaced fixed and therefore relatively targetable ICBM bases. In building this force, China has achieved the basic self-preservation goal of a strong deterrent against anything that would threaten the existence of the nation or the regime. And in addition, as with the Russian case, its nuclear force gives it a powerful potential for coercion of its neighbors and of the United States to constrain response to Chinese initiatives. My Chinese counterpart denies it, but it is widely believed that at one point he said to an American diplomat, "We know you, if we attack Taiwan, you would not do anything because you don't want to trade Los Angeles for Taipei." North Korea, and potentially Iran, we have bungled the negotiation, but at least it's better than trading playground taunts. But there is no sign that North Korea will ever totally give up its nuclear capability. So basically, we will have to rely on deterrence, which I believe should work, but there are some claims that the North Korean regime is different in the sense that it is even compared to the Russian or the Chinese, that it is a very closed system and not in normal terms, at least very rational. All the old issues are still with us. India and Pakistan in particular, I think by far the most likely occasion of an actual use of nuclear weapons would in fact be between India and Pakistan. They are complicated reasons, but I think there is a real possibility there that doesn't exist in other contexts. The Mideast is a constant danger. Israel, of course, has nuclear weapons, although they don't officially acknowledge it. The JCPOA, the Joint, I always have to think of it, the Joint Cooperative Program on something or other. Everybody calls it the JCPOA. With Iran is on the brink of collapse. And there are several other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Turkey, that would have the capability, if they chose to do so, to build nuclear weapons. There have been significant technological changes. My own view is that cyber threats to the command and control systems which control and manage the nuclear weapons may be the most serious technical problem. There is also some work on developing fundamentally new delivery systems. The one that gets the most publicity is so-called hyperglide, which is essentially a very fast, very high-flying cruise missile. The Russians have invested in what they call long-range torpedoes, which would go at a high speed from Russia to a harbor, presumably, and there launch nuclear weapons. Personally, I don't quite see the point, but undoubtedly there are people in Russia who do. Alan mentioned the National Academy's study on global high accuracy weapons. I think it's overdone as a strategic threat, but it is a significant technological development that is at the borderline between nuclear and conventional forces. Ballistic missile defense is always an issue in this context, and there has been progress, and not just for the United States. Ballistic missile defense is neither as promising as its advocates claim, nor as hopeless, at least against relatively small threats like North Korea, as its critics claim. But it's totally irrelevant to our subject tonight insofar as that's deterrence of Russia. The challenges that deterrence faces now are not only, or I think even primarily, technological, but strategic and political and even moral. There are those who question the basic principles on which deterrence is rested. The nuclear taboo, that is, the issue of principle of not seeing nuclear weapons used for any purpose for a third time. The confidence that each side will wish to avoid mortal consequences. And the general need that the existence of nuclear weapons poses for caution. The defense missile enthusiasts we still have with us. Others have never accepted the unavoidability of mutual vulnerability to attack and a call for superiority, or at least for warfighting in the sense of finding ways to use nuclear weapons to directly affect battlefield outcomes. Others sort of reject the basic logic of deterrence. Trump is supposed to have asked when he was briefed, why do we have these things if I can't use them? The answer, of course, is that the whole purpose of having them is so they don't get used, but that's and then there are issues which go to our alliance relationships. Would the United States, in fact, continue to provide the so-called nuclear umbrella for friends and allies? And conversely, can those countries count on the United States to do it? There also have been challenges, if we will, from the other end of the spectrum to the legitimacy of nuclear weapons. In some regard, the potential costs of nuclear war is so grave that we should declare possession and use illegal and embody it in an international treaty, the so-called ban treaty. One of the problems with this is no nuclear weapon state has indicated the slightest possibility of signing on to the treaty. One can respect the morality of that position, but advocacy of making it national policy or international law in the current international context is a very different proposition. And advocacy for it is too often accompanied by a denial that there is a threat, and wishful thinking about the efficacy of public advocacy in the democracies to produce a claimed result, a desired result of universal abolition. In the key countries for any general renunciation, Russia, the PRC, North Korea, Iran, the public opinion has virtually no capacity to influence government decisions on issues of national security. And also the refusal to deal with the very fundamental question of detection and enforcement of violations. And finally, the real danger that the ban treaty will undermine the non-proliferation treaty regime, which actually works remarkably well, everything considered. Abolition is certainly a legitimate long-term goal, one I support and was glad when President Obama made it a priority. Although I must say that my experience in this field, which goes back to Nixon, is that all presidents have actually been very uneasy with the very existence of nuclear weapons. And I emphatically include Richard Nixon in that. On the other hand, as a guide, and it's very useful as a guide for incremental steps, but so long as the international system is anything like what it is today, it is very hard to see abolition as a practical issue. So my first basic proposition is, in the world of international relations as it exists, there is for the foreseeable future no viable course other than to recognize that deterrence, for all its moral ambiguity, practical difficulties, offers the best hope of avoiding nuclear war. Obama had it right. Advocacy of abolition, but recognition that as long as nuclear weapons exist, the United States will, in his words, sustain safe, secure, and effective nuclear forces. And the record of deterrence is actually remarkably good. The existence of nuclear weapons is surely an important and arguably the dominant reason that a confrontation of two superpowers and their allies, clients, and partners across the entire world with massive differences in values, interests, ambitions, economies, governmental structures, and armed beyond all historical precedent, managed to avoid direct combat for 40 years. Deterrence, of course, is not the whole of international security policy, much less the whole of foreign policy or even the prevention of state-ordered violence. There were many bloody conflicts during the Cold War, and more than one crisis in which superpower conflict seemed a real possibility. But there was no nuclear war, or not even a single use of a nuclear weapon. And I think it is not generally recognized that on a worldwide basis, the percentage of the world population killed in warfare has never been as low as it has been since 1945, never in human history. Vladimir Putin put it very well, and he did so in the context not of peace advocacy, but of a long speech bragging about the wonderful new nuclear capabilities he had arranged to provide for Russia. What he said was, the threat of mutual destruction has always restrained participants in the international arena and prevented leading military powers from making hasty moves and compelled participants to respect each other. I have a lot of problems with a lot of things Putin said, but that's a very wise observation. So deterrence basic, what do we need to do to maintain deterrence? It requires that we credibly convince an adversary of both our capability and our will and intention that if sufficiently provoked, we will impose costs out of all proportion to any gain it could expect to get from the provocations being successful. It carries, and that such actions carry a high risk, even a virtual certainty, of a nuclear response. It is true, and it is the central conundrum of nuclear deterrence, that if we carried out the threat, we risk terrible consequences for us. And the very fact that nuclear weapons have begun to be used raises a risk of a spiraling out of control that has no necessary end short of mutual destruction, which counsels caution and restraint on both sides. Against adversaries without nuclear weapons, we should never need them. We have, in fact, and it has been reaffirmed by this administration, issued what are called negative security assurances, whereby the United States commits not to use nuclear weapons against any country that does not possess nuclear weapons, that is not in compliance with, that is in compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and is not in an alliance with a nuclear weapons state. For most real-world challenges, and there certainly are many, that we cannot meet with conventional military forces, gray zone operations, terrorism, insurrections, nuclear weapons are entirely irrelevant. Moreover, the idea that nuclear weapons can make up for weaknesses in conventional capability in the sense of winning on the battlefield, although often advocated, is, I believe, an illusion. For conflicts with a non-nuclear weapons state, they are unnecessary and unjustifiable. For a conflict with a nuclear weapons state, they are too dangerous. There are real challenges to our conventional capabilities that must be met. Area denial, the so-called A2AD, area denial and anti-access, cyber operations, and regional capabilities, but they aren't going to be solved with nuclear weapons. But even on the limited issue of deterring nuclear war, one has to look at different situations, different purposes. The most obvious mission is deterring major attack on U.S. territory of forces or our principal allies by maintaining forces that are sufficiently powerful and sufficiently survivable that no adversary could hope to prevent a counterblow that would greatly offset any conceivable gain. And the threat is inherently credible because the stakes in such a situation would be so great. It depends only on maintaining U.S. nuclear forces such that no conceivable attack could deny us a possibility for effective retaliation. Even effectively, if in principle, of destroying the opponent as an organized society, eliminating its conventional as well as its nuclear power, and sweeping away the ruling regime. This requirement is essentially a matter of ensuring forced survival, and it's a standard that our existing and even more our modernized forces will readily meet. But U.S. concerns for deterrence also extend to what is called in the jargon extended deterrence. That is the assurance to allies that we will provide we will extend our nuclear deterrence to protect their interests as well as our own direct ones. In the case of allies or a limited attack on United States forces, our overseas bases, for example, our interests are very great, but the threat of all-out response lacks credibility, and it has to be a more limited one. So my second proposition is that the link between preventing large-scale is the importance of the link between preventing large-scale conventional war and effective nuclear deterrence. Nuclear war is entirely unlikely to take the form of a sudden, utterly unpredictable attack. Pearl Harbor was not an example of such an attack. We can go into that later if you want. Rather, the overwhelmingly most plausible path to use of nuclear weapons is a conventional war spiraling out of control. It is a sufficient reason to seek to prevent major conventional war that a conventional war fought with modern weapons, with the full force of major powers and their allies, could be almost as disastrous as nuclear war. But it is equally true that it is also the circumstance in which there was most likely to be serious consideration of use of nuclear weapons. Conventional forces, therefore, deter not only conventional combat, but nuclear war. And conventional forces are deterrents, but I think they are an inadequate exclusive protection against major power conflict, because as Margaret Thatcher put it very well, I like to quote people I don't like. Margaret Thatcher observed that every village in Europe has in its central square a monument to the failures of conventional deterrence. So the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons as a last-ditch effort to avoid catastrophic conventional defeat is at the core of Russian nuclear doctrine, and it remains declared U.S. and NATO policy today. And it is an implicit element of the United States' commitment in Asia to Japan, the Republic of Korea, Taiwan, and other countries. Now, as during the Cold War, the purpose of retaining the nuclear option is less military and political, that the use of the extending deterrence would make clear to allies and foes alike that the United States and its allies would not accept defeat. Historically, the issue of extended deterrence focused on the prospect of exactly that, a catastrophic conventional defeat. Even with the changes in Russian policy, the possibility of a massive conventional war, which we thought was a realistic possibility, at least early in the Cold War, has become almost vanishingly remote. And that is the contingency for which the United States and its allies are best prepared, or which the credibility of collective defense efforts, even in extremis, the use of nuclear weapons, is greatest. NATO has widely continued to make that part of the policy. Now, however, there has to be attention to a different and I think fundamentally more difficult problem. That is the potential of threats of nuclear attack to seek to prevent the United States and other allies from making good on their commitment to collective defense, including even with conventional arms. Arguably, this use of nuclear threats for this coercive purpose is the main challenge to nuclear deterrence, and especially to extended deterrence today. The problem arises with particular force in a scenario in which an adversary uses local conventional power, perhaps augmented by surprise, cyber, and information operations, and the special forces, proxies, and the other instruments of gray zone conflict for a limited objective. For example, Russia seizing a part of the territory of a Baltic country in the name of rescuing Russian speakers, and then having created a crisis and effected what might be called a land grab. The attacker might threaten to use nuclear weapons if the United States or NATO intervened. That threat could be directed at least as much against our allies as against ourselves. Crimea is a worrying example because Putin said that, this is not a quote I approve of, Putin said that in the context of Crimea, he was prepared to alert, and therefore by implication in principle to use, nuclear weapons if anybody had interfered to stop the invasion. The best answer to this danger is, of course, to deny the adversary the prospect of easily producing a fait accompli at low cost. For that reason, such measures as reaffirmation of commitment and deployment of adequate conventional forces to blunt and delay an initial attack are essential. As to credibility, the problem of differential stakes for the allies, including the United States and others, is real but easy to exaggerate. NATO and our alliances in Asia are based on the correct principle that any attack on a U.S. ally poses fundamental risks to all of us, based on value, and these alliances are based not only on realpolitik, but on values of a liberal democratic order, market economy, and national independence. Lately, we seem to be doing a lot to challenge that principle, but we should stop. Both in Europe and Asia, it is U.S. policy to discourage nuclear cooperation. In order to effect that policy, it should be to make clear that while nothing is automatic about any use of nuclear weapons, any breaking of the nuclear taboo amounts to starting a nuclear war and will carry a very high risk of an effective, though proportionate, nuclear response from us. Moreover, the same profound common interest in not having a nuclear war that makes what I would call big exchange deterrence work should apply here. The weakness of coercive threats to use nuclear weapons is if the adversary did what it threatened, it would face a very real risk that our response, although intended to be limited, would be met not with accommodation. Their effort would be met not with accommodation, but with a nuclear strike. Indeed, there is some indication in recent Russian statements that for all the hype about escalate to de-escalate, they recognize the extreme riskiness of relying on a threat of a nuclear attack to back up conventional operations. And their doctrinal writings now talk more of a broader concept of integrated strategic deterrence using the full range of instruments, conventional and nuclear, but also non-military ones. I'm running out of time. So what does the United States need to do in more concrete terms? The resulting challenges are not, at least not yet, as grave as during the Cold War. But the changed overall situation means that maintaining stable and effective deterrence will require that we adapt to the new conditions. Some of the necessary actions relate to nuclear forces as such, if you will, the hardware of deterrence. The United States, under the Obama administration, embarked on a program of replacing and thereby modernizing our existing and aging strategic forces. This includes new submarines with ultimately a new missile, a new long-range bomber and a new long-range standoff weapon for the bomber force, and ultimately new ICBMs to replace Minuteman III. Broadly speaking, these modernization programs will only actually reach operational capability, start actually to be available about 2030. In addition, and it's an important part of the program, to strengthen and rehabilitate the nuclear enterprise, which is what supports the actual weapons as opposed to the launch platforms. This means sustaining the triad in all of its three elements. I think that it is important to do that, although there are people who challenge the necessity for one or more of the legs of the triad. There is more controversy about what, if anything, to do with respect to non-strategic nuclear weapons, which, broadly speaking, means short range to medium range, in the practical context of the Russians or the Chinese, weapons that can reach our allies or our forces, but not the United States. The Russians and the Chinese always make the point that ours can reach them because of where we put them. There is a huge gap in the capabilities. It is the only significant gap in terms of crude numbers between us and the Russians. The United States has a few hundred gravity bombs for delivery by jet fighter bombers, effectively, which are now based in Europe, or which could be based again in Asia. The issue is whether we should augment that capability, taking into account the fact that the Russians probably have 2,000 or so, and China and even North Korea have significant numbers. In that connection, and going beyond the Obama program, the administration proposes a single warhead, low-yield submarine warhead variant to revive nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missiles to be launched from submarines, and even to develop a successor, a ground-launched cruise missile. I think there are real questions about the military requirement for any of those, because current and program forces could carry out any plausible limited response. There is a better political and strategic case that for reasons of credibility and assurance of our allies, we should have some element in the force beside the dual-capable aircraft that could legitimately be described as peculiarly dedicated to the extended deterrence mission. There are a lot of issues about the modernization program, but one is not money. Strategic deterrence is and should be our highest defense priority. The total cost of this effort over the 10 or 20 years it would take to implement is maybe $1.5 trillion. Obviously, $1.5 trillion is a lot of money, but it is a good deal less than 0.1% of the GDP of the United States over the same period. It's maybe 1% of the federal budget at the peak, and even in terms of impact on the defense budget, and therefore competition with other defense priorities, the total defense budget over a 10-year period will be something like $60 trillion, and $1.5 trillion for the highest priority mission is hardly excessive. But we should update our doctrine that is used to guide operational planning, because nuclear deterrence cannot be based on a bluff. There have to be real capability, real plans to carry out real operations. Those are done by the military with a good deal of civilian oversight, which I participated, that guides the operational planning and relates the operational planning to doctrine. And it is my view that the President, this one or the next one, should make it clear that while the United States will not purport to commit to a comprehensive no first use policy, planners should develop options that do not depend on weapons being launched before or during an incoming strike, and that the command and control systems be sufficiently survivable that decisions need not be made under extreme time pressure and before evaluation of what has happened and how to respond. Excuse me. It is, for reasons I've explained, I think it's critical that we maintain a very powerful conventional force. This, incidentally, is where the real money comes from the defense budget. The F-35 program, which I suppose a few people in the room know what it is, because Trump complained it's too expensive, which it sort of is. It'll also cost $1.5 trillion, and nobody debates very much about the F-35. It's also important to recognize that deterrence is not only a matter of military forces of any kind. It is strengthening alliances, preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and it is engaging adversaries as a complement to building alliances and showing our capabilities. The final issue is how and indeed whether arms control, hitherto a pillar of nuclear stability but now in grave difficulty, can usefully be employed in this new context as a part of this diplomatic element of deterrence policy. Arms control was a key part of Cold War stability. It was helped by the fact that it was a bipolar world, more or less, at least in terms of ultimate issues. Each side was a status quo power. Each side had leadership, which for various reasons was relatively restrained. And they were prepared to compete, even to fight, but usually by proxy, and recognize the danger of nuclear war. This produced real effects. Overall, nuclear weapons, the number of nuclear weapons in the arsenals of the United States and Russia, at the peak in the period roughly from the mid-60s to the mid-80s, was 25,000 US and 40,000 American. That's now down to about 5,000 each, which is still too many, but it is a huge reduction. That was not all due to arms control, but a substantial part of it was. And arms control was a way of creating a context in which it was possible to have real reductions. But those arms control institutions are now under profound challenge. The United States withdrew at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration from the ABM treaty, partly over disputes over defining when a defense system that the United States felt was necessary to deal with threats like those from North Korea or potentially Iran, or in those days Iraq. The IBM treaty only limited defenses against long-range missiles. And we tried very hard, but we could not reach with the Russians a definition that was workable. And the Russians refused the Clinton administration's overture for a modification that would maintain strict limits on American defenses that could have been relevant to Russia while allowing us to build limited capability against limited attacks. And the Russians are, to be fair, deeply, if incorrectly, worried about U.S. defenses. One of the real problems that I am convinced we have to face in dealing with Putin's Russia is that Putin and the leadership genuinely seem to believe that the United States is out to eliminate Russia as a major power. And that permeates much of their attitudes toward all of these issues, including, of course, nuclear issues. As I'm sure you've read, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was signed under, which banned a whole class of nuclear weapons, that is, the relatively, the reason it was called intermediate was it wasn't the very longest range ones, which are covered by the strategic arms agreements, nor were there any limits on shorter range systems, which are mostly conventional. But it did ban the possession of a whole class of weapons whose ranges was in the middle, and therefore were primarily relevant for regional conflicts. The Russians built, I think there is no serious question, they built and developed the cruise missile, which was strictly prohibited by the treaty. And not only did they do that, they had claims against us, too, for problems with things that they were worried about. They simply, for a long period of time, denied that the thing existed. And there's no reason why you should stay in an agreement where only one side is complying. So the withdrawal was a necessary response to a clear violation, but it remains to decide how to deal with the allies in this, who simultaneously, but inconsistently, are uneasy, on the one side, uneasy at the end of the one Europe-focused arms control treaty in the nuclear field, and on the other, that they're concerned about the reliability of the U.S. commitment. The Iran deal, far from perfect, but it did impose very significant constraints on the Iranian program, and withdrawal is a self-inflicted wound. It does illustrate how the best is the enemy of the good, especially the unrealistic expectation that a good arms control agreement covering specific parameters of military forces will also fix larger political, strategic, and even behavioral problems. The Nuclear Proliferation Treaty is also under heavy pressure. And in some ways, the failure of enforcement of the Chemical Weapons Convention in Syria is a serious blow, not obviously to nuclear weapon arms control as such, but to the question of whether agreements will in fact have sufficient international support for enforcement. I think there's very little prospect that Russia and the United States can reach new big agreements modeled on the SALT and START treaties. It'd be possible to make a few hundred weapon reductions, perhaps, but it wouldn't make any difference. That in and of itself doesn't make much difference. It's desirable in principle because even after the historic reductions, we have more than is necessary to meet the deterrence criteria. But it's difficult in the period of general political tensions. Each side has, at least on its surface, an absolute requirement for the scope of the negotiations. The Russians insisting that they must cover ballistic missile defense, and the United States insisting that they must cover non-strategic, the shorter range systems. And as I say, it's complicated by the Russian grossly exaggerated, but apparently genuine conviction that the United States is attempting to undermine the very structure of the Russian state. And compliance issues have come to the fore because of INF. There are some possible steps, I think even potentially for this administration, but I must say the North Korean experience is not encouraging. There is some low-hanging fruit. First of all, and most important, the New START treaty will expire at the end of 2021, but it can be extended for a further 5 years by mutual consent, importantly not requiring ratification by either the United States Senate or the Russian Duma. That's one. My own view is that the Democratic House should insist that extension of the treaty is a necessary condition for the House voting for money for the full modernization program. Sort of a nice little modernization program you've got there. You wouldn't want anything to happen to it, would you? Second, it seems to me it would be important and useful for the two presidents to reaffirm the proposition which Gorbachev and Reagan signed on to, saying nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, simply as a proposition at a very high level. There should be strategic stability talks and more engagement generally. I think a promising area is nuclear security, which in the jargon means keeping control of nuclear materials, including those associated with nuclear power and other non-military uses of nuclear forces, because this is an area where all nuclear weapon states have a common interest. The one thing they agree on is that the government should control the nuclear weapons, not somebody else. We should also maintain de facto observance of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. There are some other things that are harder but may be possible. As I said, there may well be room for another round of central system negotiations. There may be a possibility of dealing with some of the new systems like hyperglide or the torpedo. And there are some people who believe that even if New START goes away, there is a possibility of sustaining the very extensive inspection and verification regime. I'm frankly personally doubtful about that one, but it's a good idea. It also is, I think, a time to call on both the government and the outside community to think seriously about future arms control, divorced from the question of the potential of getting anything through the United States Senate or through the whole negotiating process. So we have a kind of intellectual bank to call on when it becomes more politically possible. There are these intriguing reports of phone conversation between Putin and Trump to talk about a sort of new arms control grand bargain, supposedly covering all systems and all nuclear weapon states. And that's followed up by some interesting things that Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary Pompeo said very recently in Moscow after their meeting. It's great in principle. One idea in this connection is to have an agreement in which there's an overall limit on the sum of the number of intercontinental systems, regional systems, and BMD systems, what used to be called freedom to mix. The two countries would be able to apportion their quota, so to speak, as they wished, within various limits. One point I think is worth making, that insistence on inclusion of China is not just a mistake. I think it's too often used as a poison pill. The Chinese position, which I must say seems to me to make a great deal of sense, is that the Chinese force is a few hundred, not a few thousand. And there's no reason for China to be limited until the US and the Russian levels are at least somewhere in the same neighborhood as the Chinese. Also, one answer to that would be say, well, we should freeze. Given Chinese history, I think the idea that the Chinese leadership would agree to a treaty which would, as a matter of international law, would permanently lock China into an inferior position is vanishingly small. And the Chinese also make the argument that transparency and verification, which are the core of any arms control agreement, non-transparency is the weapon of the weak, the weapon of the low numbers. And it's just as the effect of full knowledge of the Chinese force is much different from them. So in some nuclear deterrence is a necessary but inherently dangerous and uncertain business. Nuclear weapons, however, exist and cannot be disinvented. Knowledge of how to build them cannot be erased. This is probably an appropriate place to say that the rules of nuclear physics are not subject to negotiation. Prudent defense policies and wise diplomacy, including arms control, can reduce the dangers. President Carter, who is not, in this case I'm quoting someone for whom I have great respect, President Carter, who is not notorious for eloquence of phrasing, put it very well in a letter he wrote in tribute to Harold Brown, who died recently. He said that Harold knew how to use the threat of power to keep the peace. We could do worse than have that as our guidepost. Thank you.
The floor is open for questions, and I think microphones are circulating. Okay, here we go.
You mentioned something about cybersecurity, and I'm interpreting that to mean that they could do something that would prevent us from launching anything or having any realistic
Or launched them
contact
when
with
we didn't want to.
or doing that too. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it's a terrifying concept.
Well, my own view is that in some ways the command and control system is the biggest potential vulnerability. If you talk about it in very traditional terms of being able to be highly confident that you could launch a retaliation. Also, having been, well, my basic proposition on this is anybody who tells you how the system works doesn't know, and anybody who knows won't tell you, for a very good reason. But in principle, and this is a matter of public record, there are elaborate redundancies. But ultimately, they all depend on sending messages. And there are, for a variety of reasons to be concerned about measures to interrupt those messages. The old days, it was, over EMP, for example, which would make it difficult to send normal radio signals. So the cyber world opens a whole new range of possibilities. It's not that the problem is insoluble. It's just very important. And there is a tendency, I think, to ignore, downplay what's called the C-cube problem. Because it doesn't, you can't make a very good view graph of it. It also has to be very, very closely held, much more than indeed with respect to the weapons themselves. But I think it is an area, it's an area, to be fair, where there's a lot of emphasis, and of course not just in the nuclear context. But as I say, I think it's one of the biggest, it's probably, in my mind, it's the biggest technical problem. The political problems, the strategic problems are bigger. That, I think, is the biggest technical problem.
Is this on? Yeah. So, yeah, you made the point that Putin worries a lot that the U.S. is out to get him, and I think actually you think he's exaggerating that concern, but nonetheless he has that concern. Do you see any way of, inasmuch as that's a reason he's escalating his military development, do you see anything that the U.S. might do to reduce that source of the problem?
I think he's exaggerating. I think it's totally untrue. Untrue under the previous and untrue under this. But I think he believes it. I mean, as somebody said, even paranoids have real enemies. And the problem, I think, is that relations have gotten so bad and so tense that it's hard to have a kind of honest dialogue. Now, I think from that point of view, the Pompeo-Lavrov meeting and Pompeo saw Putin is very encouraging, frankly. Putin, the statements by the two sides spent a lot of time boasting about the Russians are happy to confirm that there was no Russian collusion. They're also happy to confirm there was no Russian interference. But I think you do not convince somebody who thinks you're out to get him by swearing that you're not out to get him. That tends only to make it worse. I'm not sure that there is an answer short of trying to restore a dialogue. One of the encouraging things about the recent statement is to go back to what are called strategic stability talks, which you get, particularly military people, at least exchanging views on what they're concerned about and so on. But I think in many ways, if cyber is the biggest technical problem, this fundamental distrust on the part of the Russians is the biggest political problem.
Thank you very much for this very comprehensive view. Can you say something about the advances and challenges in detection technology? To what extent have new capability to kind of have early detection, and particularly in relation to kind of rogue actors?
Well, first of all, it is a key part of the command and control system, because a lot of it depends on assets in space, which are inherently vulnerable. I think the detection system works, which is essentially the matter of just detecting a very big infrared signal, and a lot of them. One of the things which has been true and will become increasingly true as new systems come online is it's what's called multiple phenomenology. That is, we don't depend simply on the infrared detection. We have a system which will detect very soon after launch missiles with radar. There are other devices. So that way, you have a confirmation if it's real, and you have a wait a minute, this is impossible if it's not real. It is, however, an example of if you found some way to spoof the system, it would be a very serious problem. But when I say that the command and control system is a vulnerability, I very much include detection and classification as a part of the command and control system. It's not just interfering. I guess I shouldn't. It's not just interfering with the order to launch. It's interfering with the knowledge of what's going on for various reasons in the hope of delaying a response or whatever. No, it's a major part of the problem.
You did not mention an issue which has come up in earlier years of the possible proliferation of radioactive materials which might fall short of atomic weapons but which could be exported to terrorists. Is this high on your list of concerns?
Yes. It's high on my list of terrorist concerns. It is not high on my list of general deterrence concerns. If by this you mean, I've always wondered why the terrorists don't deal with a hospital and get a whole lot of radioactive material, radioactive waste, find a way to spread it around the center of a city. Wouldn't kill very many people, would have caused huge panic and all kinds of complications. No, I think it is, I should have said it more explicitly, it is part of what I call the nuclear security issue. That's an ambiguous term because it doesn't mean security from, in my mind, doesn't mean security from nuclear war. It means the physical security of possession of radioactive and potentially nuclear materials. And the fact that it seems to me almost certain that there will continue to be a major nuclear power industry, may get bigger as people become concerned about climate change and carbon. And that generates a lot of radioactive, potentially very dangerous material that it is radioactive, and even in some cases could in principle be used to make a yield. It's not megaton yield, but it would not just be that the thing is radiating.
We have time for one more question. Over here.
Just how irrational would you consider North Korea, as a rogue state? What is possible, and how much could they surprise us?
Well, of course, by definition, with rogues, you don't know.
But how do you plan for it?
Well, first of all, I do not agree with the view that they're sort of suicidal maniacs. That is, everything they do indicates that they put a very high priority on the survival of the regime. And I don't mean this, obviously, if a whole society is destroyed, the regime is destroyed too, but the regime as a specific target. So I think that their concern that the one thing which is clear is if there was a war between the United States and its allies in North Korea would lose, as long as we were prepared to continue to press the campaign. I think that's a powerful deterrent. Their sense of what's important maybe is different from ours, but I think they're not crazy irrational. It's not like Hitler in the last few days of the war, that he was determined to pull down Germany because it was it didn't deserve to have him in control any longer. I think the possibility for unintended escalation is quite high. The North Koreans haven't done anything for a long time, which is a good thing, mostly because I think we and the South Koreans have made clear we will not let them sink another ship, for example. But it's very easy to say, well, if they sink another ship, we should attack the naval base. Probably very much what we might do. The trouble is that you can have a spiraling escalation, even from a conventional war. And I think the fact that the North Koreans might believe, for a variety of reasons, that they had an interest in escalating is the kind of, at one level, it's irrational. It's not that they don't know what they're doing. It's that they're doing something which is very much not in their interest. It's why, for all of the unbelievable amateurishness of the way that this negotiation has been conducted, it's better than calling each other names.